Moral foundations theory is supposed to allow us to understand why people behave in certain ways, why they have certain attitudes. We were just looking, among other examples, at homophobia. It's also supposed to allow us to understand cross-cultural differences. Right? Why are certain cultures, for example, people who are more socially conservative, more homophobic than others? That's the goal here. So it's very important that we try to understand what the evidence for moral foundations theory is, so that we have some sense of whether or not it can really be used. Now you might think, look, this is a narrowly empirical issue. Well, you could take it like that, but actually there's a broad philosophical question behind it. And the broad philosophical question arises like this. We know that there may be cultural variations in moral psychology, and in particular in what is and isn't an ethical issue. Something that isn't an ethical issue for me might be one for you, and conversely. That tells me that we can't assume in advance that we know for sure what the ethical issues are. Right? Something that we don't think of as an ethical issue might be something that the people we are studying do think of as an ethical issue, and it might be an ethical issue for them. So here we have a problem, or apparently anyway. If we don't know what's ethical and what isn't, how can we study cultural variations in it? And there's a danger here, isn't there? There's a danger that as researchers we might decide to impose our own views about what counts as an ethical issue. So we might say, well look, I'm a consequentialist, or I'm a virtue theorist, and these are the ethical issues. We take that normative stance. But if we do that, there's very little point in studying cultural variations. We've in a sense closed ourselves off to the very idea that there could be interesting cultural variation in advance. So there's an interesting question here. How can we study cultural variation if we don't know for sure in advance which issues are ethical? And that question will be answered by thinking about the evidence for moral foundations theory. So even though I think the story is going to be that the evidence for moral foundations theory is not super strong, the methodological approach is extremely interesting because it solves what looks like a puzzling question. So here's the thing. If you're a moral foundations theorist, you need some way to try to get at the differences in how people think about moral issues. And to that end, you use one or another variation of the moral foundation questionnaire. And in fact, there are several variations of this, but let me give you the broad idea. Suppose that you're about to decide whether something's right or wrong. To what extent will the following considerations be relevant to your thinking? Whether or not someone was harmed, is that going to be super relevant, a bit relevant, not relevant at all? Is it going to work against it? Likewise, whether or not someone suffered emotionally, is that going to be something that influences your decision? Or how about whether or not the action was disgusting, right? Is that something that you would think of as relevant to whether an action is right or wrong? Whether or not someone did something unnatural and degrading, sorry, I've gone on too far, and so on. Now, what generally happens is this. A moral foundations theory proposes roughly 5, sometimes the precise number varies, different foundations, and corresponding to each foundation will be a number of questions, sometimes 6, sometimes 3, depending on the precise questionnaire used. Those questions can be, as we've seen them here, just asking people to report on what kind of factors they take into consideration, or they can be presented in different ways. And there's also a vignette version of this study as well. Now those studies give us broadly the same results. Those questionnaires give us broadly the same results. So what do we require here? If we've got a questionnaire, the claim is that that questionnaire allows us to measure where people stand with respect to different foundations. So for example, with respect to harm, with respect to considerations about fairness and unfairness, with respect to considerations about purity, with respect to considerations about authority, and the rest. But if that's right, then we should first of all establish that the questionnaire has internal validity. Right? What we want to see is that the questions we're looking at, the 5 questions that are supposed to be associated with harm, say, do actually all hang together. They are related to each other and distinct from the other questions in this sense that the answers you give on these questions seem to be all related to each other statistically, but they're unrelated or not as closely related to answers that you give to different questions. So what we should be able to do is to work back from answers that you've given to particular questions. Let's say these are all the answers that you've given to particular questions, and show that they all hang together, they all sort of cluster together as if they relate to a particular factor in your thinking. That would be the idea. So we might put it like this. What we're observing are your answers to the individual questions. And the latent factors, the things that we don't observe, you could also call these constructs, are the 5 moral primitives that we're working with in the theory. And what we're hoping is that we can explain how people tend to answer. Should be lots of individual variation in the pattern of answers, but across variations in the answers, what we should see is that the variation is best explained by a model on which the questions cluster around 5 factors, the latent factors: harm, fairness, in-group, bias, authority, purity, and those explain how people answer the questions. That's the idea. And indeed, what Graham and colleagues have shown, and what's been shown several times across different studies, is that the 5-factor model fits the data quite well and much better than competing models. So that gives us some confidence that this is a good way of understanding the foundations, that the questionnaire taps in to the 5 foundations. Importantly, Graham and colleagues found that the 5-factor model provides a good fit across 11 different world areas. And more recently, Yilmaz and colleagues found a similar result, not quite as strong, but a similar result in a predominantly Muslim country. And that's of course important because we want to use the questionnaire in lots of different cultural contexts. And one of the key differences, of course, will be religious differences. So far that's actually quite encouraging. Things are looking pretty good. The questionnaire seems to have internal validity. It seems like a questionnaire, when you take it to a particular culture, it really does seem to tap into 5 moral foundations, which is what it's supposed to do. And it appears to do that in lots of different places around the world. Very good. Congratulations. Another thing you want is test-retest reliability. So you don't want answers to be dominated by factors that are just transient from one period to the next. Graham and colleagues therefore gave the same questionnaire to individuals roughly 37 days apart, and they found good test-retest reliability. So again, that's encouraging. That suggests that the questionnaire is getting something substantial. Now here's something much more ambitious that turned out extremely well. What we want to do is to show that if we look at other attempts to measure, for example, attitudes concerning harm or attitudes concerning purity or the rest, loyalty, authority, and so on, those other measures, how people perform on the other measures, relate closely to how they perform on the Moral Foundations questionnaire. So indeed, that's what Graham did. What they did was for each of the 5 foundations, they looked at several questionnaires which they thought would tap into just the same features of someone's ethical thinking. And what they found was that each foundation was the strongest predictor for the corresponding external scales that they associated that with. So for example, when they were thinking about harm, they used a questionnaire about empathy and a questionnaire about psychopathy, and they found that scores on those 2 questionnaires related to the harm factor on the Moral Foundations questionnaire. So again, this is extremely promising. What this suggests is that if we're looking at one particular group and we want to work out something about moral foundations and perhaps relate that to a particular behaviour, we can do that quite effectively. But here's the catch. A 4th basic requirement we need is measurement invariance. Because we want to use moral foundations theory to look at cross-cultural comparisons, in particular people who are more liberal and people who are more conservative, we need measurement invariance. Steve, what's measurement invariance? Good question. Very good question. Here's how Iurino and Saussure put it, right? And this is the really basic thing. What we want is to capture meaningful differences and not artifacts of the measurement tool that we're using itself. So my very crude analogy is this. Tom Crowther and I, my colleague Tom Crowther, you probably know him, we decide to have a sort of very curious kind of competition. We decide to work out whether people who enter his office are on average heavier than people who enter my office. And so to that end, what we do is we acquire a pair of scales and we put them in front of the door so that as people walk in, they walk across the scales and then we record the results. Now you can imagine that what happens is, after we've each had 100 people walk through our office, Tom and I calculate the scores, we average them, and I say, gosh, I've got people who are on average 2 kilograms heavier than you have coming through my office. That's an amazing, that's an amazing thing. What could explain that? But then Tom, he says, well, look, hang on a second, Steve, your scales are not calibrated in the same way as mine are, right? Your scales are off. So suddenly the comparison doesn't make any sense, because the force that people were exerting on my scales and the force that people were exerting in Tom's scales was perhaps the same on average, but it wasn't resulting in the same measurement being taken. So the difference there would be an artifact of measurement properties rather than a meaningful difference. What we want with a moral foundations questionnaire is then to be assured as well that there aren't artifacts across cultures. So for example, one culture interprets a set of questions differently from another culture, and it's that causes what looks like a difference in moral foundations, but it's really just a difference in how the questionnaire is being understood. We want to eliminate that kind of problem. So Iarino and Saucier say this is absolutely correct. I checked this in various textbooks. A finding of measurement invariance would provide some confidence that the use of the Moral Foundations Questionnaire, MFQ, across cultures can shed light on meaningful differences rather than merely reflecting measurement properties of the Moral Foundations Questionnaire. Now, when we're looking at invariance, we're looking at two things. This is actually extremely difficult to understand because it relates to rather complicated statistical methods that I don't understand, and I think most people here, not everybody, but most people won't understand. My advice here is to use this simple and straightforward rule of thumb, which I think will be okay for you. There are two kinds of invariance, metric and scalar. Although they're called different things in different texts, there's always this basic distinction. Metric invariance allows you to compare variances across populations. So if we have a questionnaire which exhibits metric invariance, then what we could say, for example, is that people who are socially conservative tend to vary a lot more in how much they weigh on purity when they're making ethical decisions than people who are socially liberal, right? In order, though, to compare means, we need scalar invariance. So, for example, to say conservatives put more weight on purity than liberals do in deciding whether an act is wrong, we would need the Moral Foundations Questionnaire to exhibit scalar invariance. Without that, we would not be in a good position to be confident that the difference is due to difference in the underlying construct, the purity, rather than the questionnaire itself, the measurement artifact itself. So does moral foundations theory provide a model that's invariant? Does the questionnaire work in that way? Davies and colleagues from 2014 found metric invariance for different gender groups. So that's good, but they didn't test scalar invariance. So that doesn't help us enormously. Davis and colleagues, note these are different researchers, they found metric but not scalar invariance for black people versus white people in the 2014 study, and they followed that up with an explanation actually, which quite interestingly is potentially linked to religion. So this looks like Moral Foundations Questionnaire isn't something that we can usefully use for cross-cultural comparisons. It appears that the measurement technique used, the questionnaire, is picking up on some kind of factors which are extraneous in such a way that differences between groups could reflect the way that the questionnaire is being understood by the subjects. And likewise, Dog-Ruhl et al. Found metric non-invariance for what they call weird versus non-weird samples. So finding metric non-invariance is really quite a blow there as well. So what does this all mean for us? What does this all mean for us? It's nicely explained by these researchers, Dog-Ruhl et al. They say, although the same statements tap into the same moral foundations in each case, that's to say that we can link the statements to the factors in each population, the strength of the link between the statements and the foundations are different across different cultural groups. Right, so these are Western educated industrial something, and these are not those in their study. Likewise, Davies, they explained that because there are problems with scalar invariance, we have to carefully consider whether the scale is working similarly across groups before conducting mean comparisons. So we need some other way of assuring ourselves. Now this is nice. Davis and colleagues are extremely subtle, and the way they formulated this is not that there is decisively a problem, but rather an attempt to show that there isn't a problem has failed. We're not in a position where we know that the Moral Foundations questionnaire fails to give us useful cross-cultural comparisons. We're in a position where we don't have good evidence to show that it does positively. We need to bear this in mind because many other cases, for example, when we were back looking at moral disengagement, we were looking at questionnaires there. It's relatively rare that you can produce a measurement tool which does exhibit scalar invariance. It's a very high standard to cross. So where are we? On our basic requirements is measurement invariance. The measurement invariance is important for us to be able to make cross-cultural comparisons as opposed to just using it within a single cultural group. And what we found here is that metric invariance gets an orange light. Measurement invariance. We don't seem to have measurement invariance for Moral Foundations questionnaire. So there should be a big question mark in our minds over the validity of the use of that questionnaire for cultural variation, which is a blow because that's exactly what we were hoping to use it for. But step back a second, Steve. Step back. What about that theoretical issue I was pushing on you earlier? So I said, you know, there might be these cultural variations. That means we don't know in advance which things are ethical issues and which aren't. But then there's a question, well, how are we going to study cultural variations at all if we can't just start by saying these are the ethical issues? So now the question I want to put to you and your lecture buddy is, does the Moral Foundations theory allow us to answer this question? Does it provide us with a way of showing that this can be done? 90 seconds, yes or no, go. Okay, that was fun. It was getting a bit noisy in here, but I don't think that's because you were talking about this question, right? Anyway, I'm sure you're super focused now. So I think the answer to this question is yes. Moral Foundations does show how we can study cultural variations without the assumption that we know in advance for sure what's ethical and what isn't. And I think it's a brilliant illustration, whether or not the particular theory that we've ended up with is right. Maybe there are some tweaks, maybe some more work is needed. The approach is fantastic, and that's why I think this is really worth studying. So what Graham and colleagues did was to start with some broadly anthropological fieldwork. What are the kind of candidates for Moral Foundations that we see across a wide range of anthropological work and also work in psychology, philosophy, anywhere else? What are candidates for Moral Foundations? Put those into a hypothetical model, be fairly liberal, right? Chuck everything in that you think you reasonably can chuck in, but try to keep it coherent so that you don't have foundations that potentially overlap with each other, for example, which would create problems later. Then use this confirmatory factor analysis approach. So try to see whether or not you can devise a questionnaire and the answers to the questionnaire all kind of hang together, cluster together in the way that your hypothetical model says they does, right? So you've confirmed that the latent factors, the constructs, seem to be responsible for the patterns in the ways people answer the questions. Insofar as that fails, you then revise the model, right? You've just been perhaps prototyping it and trying to come up with something better. Here, I think, is a very clear answer to the question, how could we do this? How could we do this? Of course, we have to start with some guesswork. That comes from our field work, but we're not committed to the truth of that guesswork in advance. We're open to the possibility of discovery. And indeed, what I think we've discovered for now is that the moral foundations theory, there's probably something to it, but it probably isn't quite right. It probably isn't quite right. And I think its proponents would accept that. Indeed, they've said much the same thing themselves and tried various ways of elaborating that theory. So where are we? Well, we're trying to show that there's evidence for moral foundations theory. And what we've seen is that so far it's moderately well supported by the evidence available, but that we need to be extremely cautious when we're interpreting claims about cross-cultural comparisons using moral foundations theory.